The first column is the setups, dry 1, dry 2, dry 3, and wet 1, wet 2, and wet 3. The second column lists the start of the day in which the molds started to become visible and observable. For the dry one, the mold growth was observed on day 7, on the last day. For dry 2, on day 7 as well as also with the dry 3. For wet 1, the mold growth was observed on day 4. And for wet 2 and wet 3, it was observed on day 3. Now for the dry one, the colors of the molds that were observed were green and white. And the texture are, for the green, it was bumpy. And for the white, it was fuzzy, almost like a hair. For the dry 2, it was only a green mold, and the texture was bumpy. For dry 3, the colors of the molds observed were green and yellow or orange. It's a bit hard to discern because the container was a bit misty because of the water, it's a bit matted. For the texture, the green was bumpy and the yellow-orange were smooth. Smooth as in they were matted on the bread and didn't really have any texture to them. For wet one, we have white, black, green or blue, and yellow or orange. The textures were, for white, it was fuzzy. Black, there was black molds that were smooth and black that were bumpy. For green-blue, there were also smooth and bumpy. And then for yellow and orange, they were also smooth and bumpy. For wet 2, we have white, black, green, and blue, yellow, and orange. The same results as in with wet 1. And as well with wet 3, it also had the same results. For the second table, we have the light setup. Dry 4 to 6 and wet 4 to 6. For the mold growth of the dry 4, it was observed on day 8, already past the 7-day interval. The color was green and the texture was smooth and bumpy. And the same results were seen on dry 5 and dry 6. For the wet 4, the colors were white, black, green, blue, yellow, orange. And wet 4, 5, and 6 all had the same results. Here are some photos. This is as of day 9. This is from the light setup, and this is for the dark setup. An observation for me was that in the light setup, the molds seem more spread on the surface of the bread. However, on the dark setup, although it wasn't as spread as the light setup, they seem denser and thicker when compared. And that is my results. Thank you for listening.
Okay. Sige, salamat, Paul. You were describing like bumpy and smooth. Yung bumpy mo kasi po, meron na po siyang fruiting bodies na nakikita natin, na nakikita doon. Okay, sige. Susunod po, sino po ang gusto? Ganun lang po kaiksi. Anybody who likes to be next? Anybody? Please take note also ng mga observations ng kaklase. Anybody who likes to be next? Or I should just call? Sige. Nauna na si Paul. Jose Emmanuel. Joe M.
Hello po, madam.
Opo, ikaw na.
Ito lang po.
Okay. Share screen, Eman.
Nakikita na po.
Yes po. Yan.
So, good afternoon, everyone. So, yung ginawa ko na lang po is generalize ko lang po yung observations ko after the 7-day
Opo,
interval.
yes po.
So, for the first setup po, we have the dry and the light. So, yung generalized descriptions ko po about the observation is more dark spots po yung nakikita around the crust area. Tapos po, meron na din pong tumubo ng spores doon po sa edge ng bread or its crack. While dun po sa dry setup in a dark area, same lang po yung observation ko doon with the light area wherein more dark spots are seen around the crust area and there are also spores forming on the edge of the bread. While doon po sa wet and in the light area, signs of mold or the brown colored in the soft area of the bread in its crust are seen, and there are also dark spots around the crust, and there are also the presence of a green mold appears hairy or fuzzy on a wet pipe setup ko po, and then orange-red bread mold naman po, which appears lumpy, and black bread mold appears hairy or fuzzy on my wet stick setup is seen. And then there is also the presence of spores po. Then for the wet dark, signs of mold on the soft area of the bread and its crust are seen, and the presence of a black bread mold or pinhead mold appears hairy or fuzzy is seen on my wet 1 and wet 3. So the presence of spores po is also found. So ito po yung pictures na pinili ko for my setups. Then for next slide, final observations po. What changes did you observe from start to finish? So yung mold starts to form faster in the bread in the wet setup of both light and dark environments, and the bread appears to deteriorate and disintegrate as the molds grow or increase in size. However, bread in a dry setup in both light and dark environments has a slower rate of mold formation. So there are only small dark spots around the crust area of the bread. And what happened to the bread setups in both dark and light areas? And what happened to the wet bread or the dry bread? So molds occur in both the light and dark areas, and molds form faster in the wet bread than the dry bread. The wet bread in dark areas is more deteriorated in form or in shape and still moist after 7 days, whereas the wet bread in light areas formed a mold, but some part of the bread is being dried out, thus decreasing the growth of the mold in the dried area of the bread. Lastly, both the dry bread in light and dark areas has a slower rate of growing molds. And that's all.
Okay, thank you. Eman, hindi pa naman spores ang nakikita mo. Ang nakikita mo po ay fruiting bodies. Okay po?
Okay. Thank you po, madam.
Yes po. Ang susunod po ay si Cherry. Che?
Hello po, ma'am.
Yes
Good
po.
afternoon po. Ma-present lang po ako.
Yes po. Opo.
Hello, so good afternoon, my dear classmates and Ma'am Ka. For today, I will discuss the results of my bread mold experiment. So, here are some of my setups with the great amount of fungi development exposed to different areas. So, out of 12 setups, I have chosen my top 4 with the most observable fungi growth. So first is, what changes did I observe from start to finish? So the growth and development of fungi are correlated with the presence of water. For a fungi to thrive in an environment, it must be in an optimal condition wherein the presence of water, oxygen, and an optimum pH is required. So the wet bread exposed to the sunlight and dark area had more fungi development than the dry breads from both areas. So various colors and textures are observed from the setup. So in general, the wet bread exposed to sunlight has black, white, green, and yellow colors of molds. For the texture, a fuzziness and lumpiness are also observed. There is also a reddish-brown discoloration from one of the setups in the wet bread exposed to sunlight. So lastly, the molds has increased its size day by day, in which the color black, so yung inner black, has become more more prominent. The same as goes with the wet bread and the dark area. So instead of a block, the green inner molds has become more prominent. There is also pure white lumpy molds spread out. For the dry bread in sunlight, a smooth green mold had been observed in day 5, so as white fuzzy molds concentrated at one side of the bread had also been observed from the dark setup. So, in terms of environment, the wet bread exposed to sunlight had yield a higher number and variety of fungi compared to the wet bread in dark area. So in terms of appearance, the wet bread setups in sunlight exposure seems to look moist. So these bread setups are exposed in peak sunlight conditions around 10 to 2 p.m. Thus, the breads were exposed more to low and medium light conditions, which increased the growth of the fungi. On the other hand, some of the wet bread setups in dark area has disintegrated, which I didn't show in the picture, due to excess water. So as a result, no fungi growth was observed in that setups. So that has too much excess water. So therefore, I conclude that the amount of water supply is crucial for fungi growth, so as the sunlight exposure. So that's all. Thank you for listening.
Okay, salamat, Cherry. And that's a very good observation because kung nakikita nyo, hindi ko nilagyan siya sa instructions. Hindi ko nilagyan ng hindi ko nilagyan ng ilang water kasi ang naisip ko was to compare your observations based on ilang amount ng water ang nilagay mo. So Cherry has this very good observation. Yung iba na hindi sobra ang water, may nag-grow na mold. But yung sobra-sobra naman really na water, ay wala namang nag-grow na mold. Diba? Doon sa inyong bread. So that's a very good observation. And please write that in your final paper. Okay. Number 5 is Hazel.
Good afternoon po, ma'am.
Opo.
Wait lang po, ma'am.
Yes po. Okay po. Wala ko ng pantalik sa hair ko. Sige, Hazel, go! Sige po.
Ay, wait lang po, ma'am. Kaya yung ano,
Okay na?
Ma'am, pwede po, next ako kaka-problem po yung sa ano ko.
Okay, ano muna, si Robert. Rob,
Okay, hello po.
okay.
Okay. Permission to present po.
Yes po.
Nakikita niyo na po, guys. So, hello, good afternoon.
Opo.
Let me share my experiences during the lab activity. So, yun yung light and dark setup po. Yung sa light setup po, near the windows for the natural sunlight, and the dark setup is placed inside the cabinet. So, to sum up yung, since 3 minutes lang yung binigay ni ma'am, yung final observation ko. Mold grows best in wet and dark environments. Thus, ang na-amaze lang talaga ako, yung sa color nila.
Okay.
Pag sa light and sa light, mas prominent yung light colors. Pag sa dark, yan, dark colors yung prominent. Alam ng mushrooms, ng fungi na pag dark colors sila, mas sunod sila. Tapos, yun lang po.
Okay, salamat Paul. That's a very good observation in the changes, in the difference in terms of colors. I mean, Robert, in terms of colors nung setup mo na nasa dark and setup mo na nasa light. So, most likely yung setup mo baka magkaibang species ng mold ang nag-grow dun sa light at dun sa dark. But you have to remember kasi na paggagawa ng tinapay, gumagamit na talaga ng fungi. Yun yung isang bagay na hindi nyo naisip. But of course, ininit and everything. But yung fungi kasi is a group of organisms na paminsan meron silang mga spores na hindi basta-basta namamatay sa mainit na sobra. At hindi siya namamatay also kapag na-expose siya sa mga extreme na mga temperatures. So most likely merong ibang nag-grow doon na tinapay sa iyo, and sa kailangan nyo ding isipin yung condition sa pag-package, yung pag-bake, kung yung environment while baking, yung packaging, paano pinackage, yung transport ng tinapay na nilagay ninyo, or kung saan pa na-expose yung tinapay nyo after being baked. So, yun ang kailangan natin. Yun din naman ang pag-isipan nyo pa. Okay? Thank you for that. Hazel, are you ready na?
Yes po, ma'am.
Okay.
Nakikita na po, ma'am.
Yes po.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hazel Ayala, and I'll be sharing my results for the bread mold experiment after following the protocol. So, there was no growth on any of the bread slices for the first 2 days of the experiment, and it was only in the morning of the third day that the first signs of the mold appeared. The experiment ended after 7 days, thus no more data is collected after that. Out of the 12 samples, not all showed signs of spoilage. For example, while the samples in the dark were the first to show signs of mold, only 5 out of 6 clearly molded in total. Whereas for those exposed to light, 4 out of its 6 samples molded in the end, but the display of molding only appeared in the last 2 days of observation. Also, there was more than one type of mold that grew during the experiment, which was assumed because of the appearance of different colors and other visible characteristics. However,
Hazel, hindi namin nakita ang pictures mo. Ginagalaw ang ano mo.
hindi po nag-change yung...
Hindi po. Lipat mo sa susunod na slide. Okay.
Nakikita na po, ma'am.
Yes po.
So, yun. However, because various molds have similarities, it is extremely difficult to reliably identify any species without the right equipment. With this, assumptions were made only on the basis of their colors and the likelihood of growing on bread. The most common bread molds include Rhizopus, Stolonifer, Aspergillus, and Penicillium, and these were the ones assumed to be identified in this experiment. A fuzzy greenish blue-gray mold was the most common mold out of all the others, and assumed that it belongs to the genus Penicillium, which is sometimes called as blue mold. The next photo is most likely an Aspergillus and was identified from its yellow color on top surface of the bread and some growth on the underside of the sample. Lastly is the Rhizopus stolonifer, also known as black bread mold, which appears like a more concentrated or darker version of another with a thread-like structure. In conclusion, most molds grows in both light and dark environments, but mold usually grows faster in the dark, and moisture is the clearest factor for this experiment. Therefore, the key to mold prevention is simply moisture control. So tackle wet areas right away. That's all po. Thank you.
Thank you, Hazel. Okay. Thank you for that observation. You are right na ang hirap pa mag-ID based on color and based on whatever kasi hindi natin nakikita ang fruiting bodies. Kadalasan ina-ID natin sila using the microscope with fruiting bodies. But nagkataon na hindi tayo magkakasama at wala tayong access with microscope. So, hanggang dun lang muna tayo sa pag-ID basically on color. Okay. Ang susunod po ay si Cecil. Cez?
Yes po. Wait
Opo, ikaw po susunod. Ang susunod kay Cecil, si Therese.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to discuss about the observations and results of my bread mold experiment. The day 7 po of the 3 wet slices of bread that are exposed to sunlight. The first wet bread has black mold with white fuzzy fibers, while the other 2 wet slices of bread have peach molds with black outlines po. Next, day 7 of the 3 dry slices of bread that are exposed to sunlight. The 3 dry slices of bread have small spots of black mold in each slice of the bread. Next, day 7 of the 3 wet slices of bread that were placed inside the cabinet. The first wet bread has fuzzy black mold and yellow mold, while the other 2 wet slices of bread have fuzzy yellow molds with filaments in each bread. All of the wet slices of bread have small green, yellow, and white molds. Some are bumpy and some are smooth. Next, day 7 of the 3 dry slices of bread that were placed inside the cabinet. The 3 dry slices of bread have small and big patches of green mold in each bread. In, in conclusion, the mold needs moisture or liquid water to grow further, and mold grows faster in the dark. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, sige. Salamat po. Ganun pa rin naman dahil nga sa hindi nyo pa naman siya binubuksan, eventually you will open and take pictures of whatever na meron na wala ng takip para mas malinaw. Okay, ang susunod po ay si Therese. Share na po. Opo. Kuya!
Kita na po.
Yes po.
So, good afternoon. I will now be presenting our results for the bread mold activity, which we were asked to observe for 7 days. I will discuss first my light setup. Mold growth was observed on the 3rd day. Sa dark bread, only black molds can be seen compared sa wet bread na black and green molds. Overall, black colored molds grew the most in both the wet and dry bread after 7 days of observation. Another observation po is walang ibang color ng mold na nag-grow sa dry bread. Black lang even after 7 days. But after checking on the 8th and 9th day, may nag-grow na green and gray. So, in terms of texture naman, since we were not allowed to open the containers, I just used visual cues to examine the texture. So, from what I have observed, mostly lumpy and ang texture sa dry bread, while lumpy and smooth texture naman ang observable sa wet bread. So, basing on the color and the texture, I identify the species as black mold, which is the rhizopus, orange bread mold, Neurospora, and green mold, Trichoderma, and the gray mold, Penicillin. So, here is the tabular data. You can see here the tabular form of my data. D meaning dry, while W means wet, and the numbers indicate what replicate order. So, for my dark setup, similar to the light setup, I observed mold growth on the 3rd day. But compared to the light setup, in my dark setup, I have observed both black and white mold growth on the 7th day. And another difference is that the black and white mold were the first mold colors to be seen on the wet bread compared to the light setup, which is light setup's wet bread, which is black and green. So here is my tabulated data for the dark setup. So in conclusion, more molds grew faster on wet bread. This may be due to the nature of the molds that thrive in wet conditions, and also the presence of the food, which is the bread, made it even more favorable. So this knowledge has implications, especially on food storage. It is necessary to keep dry food away from moisture to prevent setting a favorable condition for mold growth. So that's all. Thank you.
Salamat, Therese. Okay, ang susunod si Chelsea. Pagkatapos si Chelsea, si Dwayne.
Present screen na po ako.
Yes po. Sige lang.
Nakikita na po.
Opo.
Okay, good afternoon everyone, and I am Chelsea Rapalio, and I will be presenting the results of my bread mold experiment. So first, the mold formation was seen starting on day 2, February 25, both on dark and light setups only, and only on the wet bread samples showed mold growth. So for the dark setup, most of the growing molds were white and green. Encircled in red on the pictures are white colored molds, and encircled in blue are green colored molds. The white molds were circular, they are fuzzy and lumpy. And for the green molds, they look like small balls or dots on the bread, but they are smooth and lumpy. Next is for the light setup. White, green, and yellow molds were seen growing, also on the wet bread samples. And also encircled in red are the white molds, and encircled in blue are the green molds. However, on sample 3, I've noticed a yellow stain like on the underside of the bread. So I assume that it's a mold, and I observed it for the next day. So comparing the two setups, fewer molds in light available setup were seen than in dark setup. Next is on the 8th day, yesterday, March 3. The molds grew bigger. And on the dark setup, all of the bread samples have various molds on them. You can see black and green mold on wet bread sample 1, where the black mold is almost covered the whole bread. And on wet bread sample 2, white, black, and green molds are seen. And lastly, wet bread sample 3, black, green, and yellow molds. Then on the dry bread samples, white, black, and green molds were seen mostly on the sides. And on the light setup, only molds from the wet bread samples continue to grow. Various molds such as white, black, green, and yellow are seen. And again, comparing the samples from the two setups, molds proliferate more and faster on a wet bread sample in a dark setup. That's all po. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Very good observation on saan siya nag-grow, paano siya nag-grow, at paano siya nag-spread. Okay, Dwayne? Dito pa po ba si Dwayne? 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 Wala na ba siya? Wala na?
Na-disconnect po yata, ma'am.
Okay, before, corn. Ikaw na corn. Corn, after corn, Dinah. After Dinah, Donabel.
Hello po, good afternoon po. Narinig na po ako.
Yes po.
Wait lang po, share ko lang. Kita niyo na po.
Opo.
Okay, good afternoon po. This is my presentation po about my bread mold experiment po for the past 7 days po. So, ito po yung setups ko po. I label them as dry, light, and wet light for the light setups, and then dry dark and wet dark for the dark setups po. And then yung dark setups ko po, I place them inside a cabinet po. And then yung light setups po, I place them near the window po. Okay. Ito po yung initial observation ko po sa after 3 days. Nung first 2 days po, wala pa akong nakitang tawag nun, growth po. Pero po, nagkameron po sila ng discoloration po on the wet setups. And then on the third day po, ito po yung nakita ko. Bigla po natubo itong that I think on my visual inspection po, the rise of stolonifer and then it's either penicillin po or ibang genus po. And then ito po, yung yellow part, usually po, mga yellow part po yung nakikita ko. Marami sa ibang setup, on the wet setups specifically po. It's either po on the Aspergillus species po, I think. And then, ito po, I think Aspergillus din po kasi based on my previous knowledge po, yung mga Aspergillus is fuzzy. Fuzzy yung growth po. And then, yan po yung ibang samples po. May yellow po and then orange, which is nasa Aspergillus rin po kasi it's either yellow or green light yung colors na. And then, yun po. Kasi malabo po talaga mag-picture sa kasi medyo translucent yung.
I know.
And then, here po yung, ito po yung parang pinagbasehan ko ng aking visual inspection po based on their form, elevation, and margin po.
Okay. Very good.
Yes po, madam. Yun lang
Okay,
po.
thank you. Thank you for that, Corn. Yun na nga, dahil nga po sa hindi tayo nakakapag-culture mag-isa sa culture medium at pag nagko-culture ka actually sa bread mold, ang dami mo pwedeng actually ma-isolate dun sa isang container mo na wet at dry. Ang dami mo dun pwedeng ma-isolate. Pwede kang makapag-isolate ng siguro lahat ng species ng mold dun sa isang bread lang. At kung magkukulture at kung magpupure culture eventually, dahil palagi naman siyang nakocontaminate, nagsasama-sama sila talaga lahat, ayaw nilang maghiwa-hiwalay. Ganon ang nangyayari. Okay, salamat for that, Corn. Nandyan na ba si Dwayne? Wala pa rin? Sige, Dinah.
Ma-present screen na po.
Yes po.
Wait lang po, naglalag. So, good afternoon po. So, ang na-observe ko po during sa pag-grow ng mold, as the day increases po, yung molds nag-increase din po. From white bread po, nagkaroon ng yellow spot or patches po. Then, nagkaroon po ng black dots or patches na lumaki po habang tumatagal. And then, nagkaroon din po ng cotton-like structure. Medyo po malabo yung images kasi may mga water kapag nagpipicture. And then, as the day increases po, yung area po na may bread, nag-i-increase din po. To the point po na yung ibang bread, naging black na po yung lahat. Next po is yung observation po sa different setup. Sa dry bread po, sa light na area, na it took a while po na magkaroon ng signs of mold. Then, the only thing that was formed was the brown dots on the crust of the bread and the black spores. Ito po. Meron lang po dito mga dots, and meron pong parang mga charcoal sa ibabaw. Then, sa dry bread po, sa dark setup, it took a while for any signs of the mold to form and has more container that has mold or black dot form. Then, meron din pong mga brown dots sa crust ng bread. Ito po. Then, sa wet bread po, sa light area, the formation of the mold is faster compared to the dry bread, compared po dito. And, mas marami pong variants ng mold na na-form. Meron pong yellow, green, black. And meron din pong na-form na cotton-like structure sa bread.
Okay.
Sa dark setup naman po, na wet bread, the formation of the mold is faster compared to sa lahat pong setup. And the bread turned black and the whole surface had been consumed by the black patches. A cotton-like structure also formed and it increases in size as the day passed by. Yung iba pong dark setup na wet, yung bread po naging black na po. And then ito po yung picture nung meron pong cotton-like structure na habang tumatagal po, nag increase yung height. Yan lang po. Thank you po.
Okay. Sige, salamat for that, Dinah. Ang susunod po ay si Donna Bell.
Okay po, I'll be sharing my screen. Hello? Kita na po ba yung presentation? So, okay, good afternoon everyone. I'll be sharing my 7-day experiment for this bread mold experiment as laboratory activity 1 for mycology. So here, I have my general observations. So for dark area, as we know, molds grow faster. And in the lighted area, it's the opposite. I think the possible reason is that, as we know, fungi aren't photosynthetic unlike plants. So they don't really need light
Ay, hindi
to...
sila. Teka. Photosynthetic ba ang fungi? Eh di dapat
Aren't
plants ang application nila. Hindi po sila photosynthetic na pag-usapan po natin yan sa naunang
Yes po,
lesson.
ma'am. I said po. Yes po, ma'am. I said po, ma'am, unlike plants.
Okay.
Also,
Sige.
so, unlike plants po, fungi aren't photosynthetic. That's why they don't need light to produce their food. So here in my presentation, in the dark area, molds grow faster. And in the lighted area, it's the opposite. Baka may naano lang po ata sa audio. Or I said unlike. So,
Okay.
yes po. So for the both setups, I have observed these similarities. The colors dark green, white, brown, and yellow were observed, and the textures fuzzy, smooth, and lumpy, but of course with the different intensities for both areas. But for both setups, in the first 2 days, there were no observed growth of the molds. It was only in the 3rd day that molds started to appear, but not that visible, only in a closer look. And I have also observed that there's an increasing height of the mold. So it was ranging from 3 to 7 millimeter. So at first, molds only grow at the sides of the bread. But on the 6th and the 7th day of the experiment, it was for the wet bread, of course, again, molds grew faster. In the dry bread, in the dry bread, molds grow slower. And here's my pictures. So as you can see, there were less growth observed in the containers. I think the reason is that I only sprayed 2 to 3 spray of water. That's why there's a lesser growth observed. Yan lang po, ma'am.
Okay, thank you for that, Donna Bell. Well, yun nga with you, I regulated yung paglalagay ng water. So, now you know na hindi pala sapat yun for the growth of for sustaining the growth of your mold. But nevertheless, nag-grow ang iyong mold. Okay, ang susunod po si Erica.
Good afternoon po. Wait lang po.
Opo.
Magpe-present lang po ako.
Yes po.
So, good afternoon po. I'm Erica K. Binary, BS Biology 3B, and this afternoon I'm going to present my observation for the bread mold experiment. Wait lang po, naglalag po ang laptop. So here po are the So here po are the photos of my setup. So sa day 1 to 2 po, yung una pong nag-grow is parang small lang po na white na may green dot sa gitna. Tapos may dalawang green na sa may katabi niya. Sa setup 2, yung wet po na exposed to sunlight. And same po with the setup 1 na wet din po sa sunlight. May isa pong nag-grow na parang dot lang po na color green. And sa dark po, yung nag-grow lang is sa setup 2 na wet na parang ano lang siya, fuzzy na white na parang cotton like lang. Sa day 3 to 4, dito madami na yung nag-grow sa lahat ng setup, sa wet setup na exposed to sunlight. Like from small dot na parang may white lang na may dot sa gitna to becoming parang madaming nasakop niya na yung buong bread. Tapos lumaki na din yung fuzzy white na cotton-like na mold. And sa wet 1 and wet 3 setup, nagkaroon na rin ng maraming green na parang mga dots. And sa dark setup, yung wet is from fuzzy like na small lang din into this na sobrang madami na. And may mga color yellow and green, halo-halo na sila. So sa day 5 to 6, ganun pa rin pero mas dumami and mas kumapal na yung mga molds. So it's a sign na madami ng mga nag-grow and sinasakop niya na yung buong bread. And sa day 7 to 8, dito mas visible na siya and mas maganda na siya tingnan. Like this, sobrang laki na nung dating white na maliit lang. Ngayon, sobrang laki niya na. And dito din sa other setups. However, sa dry setups, pareho sa dark and sa exposed to light, as you can see, parang wala lang siya, di ba? Pero sa gilid, meron siyang maliit na fuzzy white na mold. So, ang ginawa ko dito is, yung wet setups ko, inisprayan ko lang siya ng 50 times lang. Kaya siguro maganda yung grow ng mga molds kasi parang sakto lang yung pagka-moist niya. Hindi siya yung sobrang basa and hindi din yung parang marala yung parang hindi ano ba yun? Basta hindi siya yung sobrang basa. So
Okay.
yung bread, yung as you can see po, kinuha ko lang po yung may magandang mga formation of molds. So yung una po na type ng mold na makikita is yung Penicillium sp, which is the most common type ng mold sa mga breads. And it appears as fuzzy patches that are lightly colored and tending to be white or gray. So ito po yung parang ganong type. So yung next type is the Cladosporium sp, which can be identified on bread as large and round mold spots that appear fairly smooth and tend to be darkly colored from dark green to black. So ganito po yung parang itsura niya. Ito po na may black na circle. and this one. So ito naman po na green, na smooth. Yung third type po niya ang pangalan niya po is Aspergillus sp, which grows as fuzzy patches on bread, and the spots are color yellow or light green in color. So yun po, may 3 types na nag-grow sa bread ko po. Yun lang po. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Erica. Very good ang iyong mga observations kung paano sila nag-grow at kung saan-saan and the formation ng kanilang growth patterns. Okay, next one is Jeremy, and then next one is John, and then next is Johanne. Wala pa ba si Dwayne?
Hello po, madam.
Wala pa? Sige. Okay po.
Mag-present screen lang po.
Yes po.
Nakikita na po.
Yes po.
Okay po, good afternoon. Hello po, and good afternoon to everyone. So, here is my compilation po of my observations from day 1 to day 7. And I started last Tuesday, February 23rd, and ended on March 1st. So, i-compile ko lang po yung first and second days there because there is not much evident on mold growth and only discoloration of some bread samples were seen. For day 3 po, many molds started to proliferate, such as white, black, blue-green, and yellow molds which mostly have fuzzy textures. And for the dry setups po, all samples started to have black-brown spots on their corners or sides. And on day 4, many black molds with fruiting bodies became bigger. The molds are growing and had more varieties. The dry setup had multiplying dark brown black colonies up to 40 to 60 in numbers. And for day 5, the molds are continuously growing and new ones appeared that cover almost all of the bread surfaces. The dry setups have increasing numbers of black-brown spots and also started to grow on the corner of the bread. And for the grayish-green mold. And for day 6, all the colonies in wet samples are now merging with each other, and the fruiting bodies are now more prominent on this day. On the last day of observation, the black mold overgrew up to the lid of the containers, and there are also powdery substances on the sides of the container, which I suppose those are the spores. And the samples are now fuzzier and bigger, and especially in the dark and wet setups. And also, meron din akong nakitang creeping white colonies on the surfaces of the bread. And for the dry setup, the mold colonies are now merging with each other. The surface of the bread is now covered with brown spots or grayish-green colonies. So for my final observation, molds prefer a dark and moist environment. Although they grew in a well-lit surroundings, molds in wet and dark samples have bigger, fuzzier, and thicker in texture and had more varieties. And for me, it is also amazing that they can merge all together even if they are different species of molds. And another observation is that yung mga nauna mag-form ng molds sa sides of the bread because they were more exposed than any other part of the loaf. And because of that, I become knowledgeable on the optimal living conditions to where molds emerge, and or it can be prevented, of course, by drying wet areas immediately and having proper ventilation, and also always sanitizing the area. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you po.
Thank you po, Jeremy. And the next one is John and Julian and Julina.